As we get started, my name is John Bischoff. I'm the director of our Institute for Engineering and Medicine, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today and also the Otto Schmidt Distinguished Lecture Series. This series is designed to foster discussion of the grand challenges for engineering and medicine. And IEM invites national opinion leaders in research, industry, and government to give one or two talks each academic year. These public lectures are named in honor of Dr. Otto Schmidt, a longtime University of Minnesota professor of biophysics, bioengineering, and electrical engineering, who made significant contributions to a wide range of fields, including submarine detection, electrocardiography, and quality of life measures. So today, we have with us Dr. Rick Kuntz, who is the retired Senior Vice President, Chief Medical and Scientific Officer of Medtronic. He served as a member of the company's executive committee. In this role, he oversaw the company's medical affairs, health policy and reimbursement, clinical research activities, and corporate technology. Dr. Kuntz joined Medtronic in October 2005 as Senior Vice President and President of Medtronic's neuromodulation, which encompasses the company's products and therapies used in the treatment of chronic pain, movement disorders, spasticity, overactive bladder and urinary retention, benign prostatic hyperplasia, and gastroparesis. In this role, he was responsible for the research, development, operations, and product sales and marketing for each of these therapeutic areas worldwide. Prior to Medtronic, Dr. Kuntz was the founder and chief scientific officer of the Harvard Clinical Research Institute, a university-based contract research organization which coordinated NIH and industry clinical trials with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Kuntz has directed over 100 multi-center clinical trials and has authored more than 250 original publications. He also served as Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Chief of the Division of Clinical Biometrics, and an interventional cardiologist in the Division of Cardiovascular Diseases at Brigham and Women's in Boston. Kuntz has served as a member of the Board of Governors of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute since it was established in 2010 as part of the Affordable Care Act. He graduated from Miami University in Ohio and received his medical degree from Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. He completed his residency and chief residency in internal medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, and then completed fellowships in cardiovascular diseases and interventional cardiology at the Beth Israel Hospital and Harvard Medical School in Boston. Kuntz also received his Master's of Science in Biostatistics from the Harvard School of Public Health, and I believe that's also where he met his wife, who is a faculty member here at the University of Minnesota. Since retiring, he's been on many boards and working with many companies, many groups. He actually worked with IEM on an NSF engines proposal that wasn't ultimately successful, but then he's worked on some others in the digital health area. We've been really appreciative of him taking his time to engage with us, and he's going to talk to us today about his vision for digital health in the future, based on his extensive experience in the field. Rick? So I think you just need to get in here. Great.
All right, that's the biggest challenge. Thanks. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. We talked about what might be an interesting topic for this lecture series, and I think we're all struck with the notion that we're undergoing a revolution now in digital health. And I'll try to explain what that means. But I also wanted to just talk about my viewpoint about what Medtech needs to do to engage this change in digital health and what it means. My outline will be, I'll review kind of the brief history of the typical business model for Medtech, focusing mainly on my experience with Medtronic. But then why do we need a digital health revolution? The promises that digital health offers and also challenges. What Medtech has to do to adapt to this changing digital world. A special interest of mine with my clinical trials background is how do we develop evidence in this new digital world where data may become very available in real time. And then also examples outside of Medtronic of small companies that are trying to embrace digital health by developing a variety of new interesting biometric sensors and the challenges that they have to integrate into this, this digital world. And then finally, a conclusion with respect to what I think Medtech needs to do to embrace digital health. So John talked about my background. I just wanted to mention that my influences on this kind of talk is probably based more on my background in statistics and clinical trial methodology in how I would view advancing digital health. So if we look at a company like Medtronic, the kind of common business model has been the relationship between a physician and an engineer. Everybody knows this story that I'll just briefly talk about, which was the heart surgeon Walter Lillehei, who was world renowned for doing congenital heart operations in young babies at the University of Minnesota, and who, by the way, trained almost every major heart surgeon in the 60s and 70s, had a death due to the fact that after the operation, one has to use a temporary pacemaker for the child who has a stunned pacemaker system internally, and it's an AC-powered pacemaker with an inverter to DC. And there's a power outage in Minnesota due to a storm. The child didn't receive the pacing, temporary pacing, and died. He talked to Earl Bakken, the founder of Medtronic, who was a engineering grad from the University of Minnesota, who repaired a lot of these vacuum tube devices in the late 40s and early 50s, and asked them to develop a battery-powered pacemaker so this would never happen again. And part of the myth, which I don't know if it's true or not, but sounds good, is that Earl Bakken took a copy of Popular Electronics and found this circuit that he could purchase for a metronome, and was able to modify that circuit to make a pacemaker. And that's a picture of the first pacemaker that was used for babies that could be used and not have to worry about power outage. So this is like the classical story about an unmet need defined by a physician working with an engineer to help solve that problem. And that's the common, I think, theme of medical device tech for a long time and still exists today. From that, we're able to develop a company like Medtronic has over 100,000 employees, bound together by mission statements like the focus on the patient. And these mission statements are taken to heart by all employees. I've witnessed that in my career multiple times. And it's the reason why people work nights and weekends for their job, because they know that their output is connected to patients. The typical approach towards understanding where to develop your pipeline and going forward is to examine the variety of different global megatrends and strategic imperatives that exist from marketing, upstream and downstream marketing, as well as just understanding physiological and pathological conditions, trying to understand whether there's a interface with a potential medical device solution. And then there's a variety of different models that one looks at the development and R&D of products in their pipeline. This is just a unique one for Medtronic. Other companies have very similar ones with different labels. But the idea is to basically understand whether you're going to invent a new market, like Earl did with the battery-powered pacemaker, to continually innovate on that product, which is probably the biggest part of what R&D does at a company like Medtronic, which is, in this case, to make it smaller so that we take a big hockey puck and turn it into something about the size of a quarter over the course of 20 years, so much easier to use, to disrupting the pacemaker technology by using a device that doesn't even have a lead anymore. No longer do you go to the subclavicle area, go to the subclavian to the right ventricle, but you actually put a small vitamin-sized pill into the tip of the right ventricle that has both a radio, ability to pace, and ability to sense atrial contractions. So that's the kind of like classic approach to improving technology over time. And this has been applied to a variety of different business units at the company and can be expanded, but this is the kind of common thread that people use, whether it's looking at transcatheter valves, aortic stents, or other electrical implantable devices. With that comes the focus on disciplines needed to make this stuff work. And so this is another focus of the, again, R&D side, of a company like a medical technology company like, Medtronic or Boston Scientific or St. Jude or Abbott, is that we have to have fundamental discipline experts in areas, I won't go through all these, to be able to have the capability to solve a problem when presented by an unmet need by a clinician. But I think what underscores it more is that the fundamental kind of concept to developing life-saving therapies and improvement of life therapies has been this fundamental relationship between an engineer, mainly in the electrical, biometric, or mechanical engineering space, and a physician who identifies unmet needs. So why do we need to have a digital health revolution, which is kind of outside that box? And this is why. If we look at the current state of health, especially in the US, it's not good. If we look at the World Health Organization, health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmary. In the US, health policies, health system investments remain misaligned with this concept. And I'll talk about the concept of episode-based medicine versus continuous preventive medicine. So we have these sobering statistics which we have to fix. Per capita, the US expenditure on healthcare is greater than 200% more than any economically developed country. Yet health inequities prevail much more than those who spend much less. With stark differences in lifespan, quality of life, severity of disease across the entire socioeconomic spectrum, accounting for greater than $40 billion of lost productivity and greater than $90 billion of excess medical costs annually. So this is really not sustainable. In the US, health policies, health systems remained misaligned as 90% of all health expenditures go to disease and injury treatment rather than to addressing the predisposing factors of these illnesses and injuries. So that definition that the World Health Organization mentioned about what health is at the top of the slide here is not being focused in the current system, which is based on most of the expenditures being in the episodes of disease and events. More sobering is the expenditure on healthcare with questionable results compared to other economically developed countries. The US has grown to 4.1 trillion as of 2020. If we predict what it will be by 2028, it will be over 6 trillion annually, which will encompass 20% or more of our GDP. So this is not sustainable. And the model of episodic care has to change. More so, majority Black urban populations such as Detroit, with 79% African Americans, Cleveland, with almost 50% African Americans, have a 6-year deficit in median life expectancy compared to the US average of 79 years. This is an unacceptable statistic. But even more sobering is in Cleveland, and this again was my exposure to the Cleveland Case Western NSF grant engine effort that I've been involved with. The population health system there demonstrates that there's a 23-year life expectancy gap that separates neighborhoods who live only 8 miles apart along Euclid Avenue, minutes from 2 world-class healthcare systems. So in the shadow of the Cleveland Clinic, in the shadow of University Healthcare Systems, 2 world-class, that space of 8 miles has a 23-year difference in life expectancy. This is something we can't tolerate. So why do we need a digital health revolution? The current episodic focused healthcare system in the US is largely inefficient, overly expensive, and needs a more continuous and preventive health approach. This is where I'll try to thread in the notion that digital health might provide that bridge to gap there. So the thesis that I'm proposing is that advancing digital health, and I'll define what digital health is through the World Health Organization and also the National Academy of Medicine, with its more intensive real-time data collection, data access and accessories such as home and wearable sensors, telemedicine, et cetera, and near real-time predictive analytics will address the gap in prevention and improve the access to healthcare for the underserved. That I'm going to try to prove to you over the remaining part of this lecture, and also what Medtech should do to engage that. So what is the promise and also challenges of digital health? Well, why digital health? This is a cartoon that we use for our grant application, which demonstrated that the current status is that we have a lot of medical data in the hospital, but the usable component is very small. And anybody who's tried to get meaningful information to aggregate electronic health records together for research has recognized how difficult it is to get information, even basic demographics, from electronic health records, because there are few, if any, standards in the current systems by which we record clinical practice. The usable data is tiny, and mainly that comes from parallel data systems that are used, such as registries or clinical trials. The other complication associated with the current aspect is that we have this episode of clinical visits and then episodes of waiting till the patient has a change in their chronic disease for readmission, with no connection in between. So clinicians are encumbered by the notion that they may see a patient every 3 to 6 months, and in their 10-minute or 15-minute visit, they have to be able to predict the trajectory of that chronic disease for the next 3 to 6 months till the next visit, change the medications or their other therapies, and hope that that patient stays in good shape, with no way of monitoring a change in that chronic disease that could change the medications or the therapies to prevent an episode of care, which ends up with, in the case of COPD or heart failure, an emergency room visit, maybe an ICU visit, maybe a long hospital stay, and maybe a death. So this is also difficult. The final thing is the follow-up is also lost in our current system. That is that if we want to understand what the impact was of a medication change or whatever, we have to wait until the follow-up visit to understand whether that effect occurred. So the real-time ability to change that activity is minimized. And that's the common model in the US. The number 3 on here just shows what I showed earlier, which is this is a map of healthcare disparities. I don't have the legend under it, but you can imagine that the darker the images looking at Detroit and Cleveland are associated with the massive differences in healthcare disparity. Well, David Eddy, who is a well-known opinion leader, mathematician, decision scientist to some degree, stated that the complexity of medicine now exceeds the capacity of the human mind. So that's a comment that was quoted in the New England Journal of Medicine. And when was that quoted? In 1982. So we've recognized for a while that the current systems are difficult to operate. And the idea that a physician or a healthcare team can understand the entire complexity of medicine and produce outcomes that are optimum for a patient is probably not true anymore. This is the underlying motivation for why we should be able to get a digital health system that collects aggregatable data so that we can get better insight using predictive analytics like machine learning and AI. So what's digital health in the 21st century? This is a definition instead of quotes from National Academy of Medicine as of last summer. Digital health has evolved as a broad term encompassing electronic captured data, along with technical and communications infrastructure and applications in the health ecosystem. So again, this is about electronic captured records we have, but also a system of technical and communications that make it interoperable to develop the healthcare ecosystem. Developments such as cloud computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, digital mediated diagnostics and treatments, telehealth, consumer-facing mobile health applications are now routinely used in self-management, healthcare, and biomedical science, but it's still in the minority of individuals who experience this, and it's not organized. But these developments promise to drive earlier diagnosis and interventions, improve outcomes, and support more engaged patients. So I think that last line is true. They promise to do this. There's no question that we can get a more continuous measurement on individuals. We will be able to deliver earlier diagnoses, but more importantly for the disparities I just outlined, better access and quicker access. The application of digital health technology at scale serves as a nervous system for the continuously learning healthcare system. And the learning healthcare system here is strong, and one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement, innovation, and equity. equity is important. With best practice discovery of seamlessly embedded in the delivery process, individuals and families, active participants in all elements, and knowledge generated as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. So the idea is that today's patient teaches us about how to treat tomorrow's patient through a continuous learning experience. This is, again, the National Academy of Medicine definition. I think these are aspirational parts of this, but the learning healthcare system isn't optimized until we have a digital health system and infrastructure. What are the challenges? Well, healthcare systems are still largely fragmented. So if we want to look at this way to have interoperability, we've got to solve the fragmentation component. Data systems like EHRs, labs, imaging, drug device inventory, outpatient clinics, et cetera, need to have seamless interoperability in order for the data to be aggregated and analyzed for proper inference and decision making. So I'm going to talk about this inference stuff over and over again, in that we're used to understanding that when you take a clinical trial and compare treatment A to treatment B and do a statistical test, that you're basically relying on that statistical test to tell you whether you can make inference about the results. But that's from a very structured system where the data is structured, the patients are structured and well known. If we want to be able to have any kind of system that can be aggregatable and analyzed for decision making, we've got to make sure that we have interoperability of the data. The 21st Century Cures Act addresses the foundational standards to drive interoperability, mainly through the Office of National Coordinator, ONC, and advocates for better curation methods and APIs that interface with the EHRs, such as Epic and Cerner. The ONC has pushed forward these new data standards, such as the HL7 FHIR standards, which have been around for a while, but are still slowly kind of being used a little bit more, and then other standards out there like SNOMED, NOMOP. So we do have tools out there that can communicate through messages between electronic health records to try to standardize the data to make it more interoperable and usable. On top of that, another challenge is the data provenance. That is that when we start to get these data that can be aggregatable, we have to consider the fact that the patient still has ownership of their data. What is the privacy and data rights that one would have to be able to analyze this data? This is a tricky issue. It requires a lot of interest in policymakers and others to come up with this, but also involvement with patients from the start so they can understand that, yes, sometimes contribution of your own data is good for the whole. And responses from patient groups has been that they're very willing to share data if their privacy doesn't get violated and they can help other patients. Longitudinal data continuity between in-hospital records and local regional outpatient clinics is often difficult. This is a huge problem. So when I was at Medtronic trying to come up with alternative methods to do clinical research or product surveillance, we often would get really good continuity with understanding what devices were used in the hospital. But what I'm really interested in is that patient still alive 2 or 3 years later? Is that patient free from any complications 3 or 4 years later? We don't have good continuity with where they go for their outpatient clinic because they go all over the place. So if they're in network, a better chance of having it. If the clinic is in the same network as the tertiary hospital or in-hospital group, that's good. If they go somewhere else, we don't really have good connections to be able to understand how to make those follow-ups. And when we do clinical trials today, we pay expensive research individuals time to call people at home to find out if they're alive or dead or if they're doing all right. So we still have a very manual way of doing follow-up. That has to be changed in the digital health revolution so we can get access to this earlier. So there have been a variety of themes here, and this is something generated by the data science group here at the University of Minnesota under Dr. Milton Moe and others, that if you can combine data in many ways. I won't get into details about the federated data systems, but in general, these are ways that one could protect the data from being combined in a classical way, like a spreadsheet, but you use software instructions to be able to aggregate the data you need to come up with an outcome without violating privacy. That data can then be used in the cycle of learning healthcare systems, as in the middle cartoon shows. But what's critical is that one has to have more input of biometric data, because the only input that you get normally is from in-hospital metrics. We need to get this stuff on the outside to be able to get these learning healthcare systems working, especially in a continuous digital health system. Despite these important gains, according to the National Academy of Medicine, of the last few decades, the promise of digital health still remains illusory. And why is that? Well, it's complicated. Part of it is that the applications of digital health in its optimal sense are very multiple. You can see here. So it's exciting to see what we can do, but each of these applications, I'll read them all, but they're you can see them on the screen, requires a solid infrastructure to be able to connect and a permission to be able to use data for all those applications. So we still have a policy issue to get there, and I think as we get this evolution of data to digital health, we have to say both there's a physical infrastructural component and there's also a policy component. Moreover, the infrastructure part that I talked about has to go beyond just the hospital and be able to embrace a variety of different components, both in measuring behavioral health, physical health, and also input that measures things like behavior in order for us to be able to get a better prediction of what works for patients and make them healthy, according to the WHO definition of health. And then there have been a variety of principles developed over time, this again from the National Academy of Medicine, to become stewards for data health infrastructure and data. So there's a lot of work that has to go into this. In order to be able to leverage data, one has to have a variety of different rules to make sure that there's discretion on personal data, the data is safe, know that the data has good enough quality so it could be effective, and so on as we move down. These are rules that are generally a little bit more complicated than you would do in a clinical trial because it's all embedded within a case report form and in a protocol. But these are the requirements for us to have use of clinical practice databases to put them into a use condition for analysis. What do we have to do from Medtech to adapt to this, and what kind of contributions can we make to this digital system? Medtech must focus on data and sensors, period. So the first part is the interoperable data systems must be developed for implantable and wearable medical devices. And I'll just make some comments here. Most of the implantable data devices, especially electronic devices like pacemakers or deep brain stimulators or spinal cord stimulators, have memory and record physiological and therapeutic signals and can be downloaded through radios and telemetry to databases. However, those databases are generally collected and stored by the company. And sometimes summaries of that data can go out on an individual basis to practitioners, especially programming changes and so on. But it's not a broad, interoperable system that can be combined with other rich data in the hospital, like electronic health records and other data in the hospital. So we have a variety of systems, but they're not interoperable with other groups. So we have to have that in order to share data, information, analyses, especially if we're going to start to do sophisticated predictive analytics like AI and ML to optimize the promise of disease prevention and good health promised by the digital health revolution. Medtech also has to focus on developing devices with embedded biometric sensor technology. We have that already to some degree, but it has to be expanded further. And we have to start thinking about things non-implantable, better wearable biometric technology, better data communication storage systems, data sharing platforms, the permission to share data. This is something that still is a problem with industry to some degree. Unless we do this, we won't realize the promise of optimum healthcare and disease prevention. It's really moving away from the business model of episodic care. And that's a big statement because medical device companies get paid for episodes of disease. And so we have to be able to get payers to work with us, say, how do we get paid for developing devices that prevent disease? It's not easy to do. It's hard to do that in a for-profit, publicly traded company, but we have to have an agreement with that. And I think the leadership is going to be in academic medical centers to drive that so that industry has to follow. Again, industry does have a variety of cloud-stored data systems. These are just a general model of device identification that we use for some of our surveillance techniques, but they're stored separately from the hospital. We're seeing some early collaborations. we have a relationship with the University of West Virginia to use our cardiac resynchronization device and a link device which measures EKGs and other impedance as a surrogate for heart failure, to be able to look at patients who get a cardiac resynchronization device to improve their heart failure and keep them out of the hospital by working on the data that they get from both EKG patterns that we know will lead to heart failure and or impedance we can measure with the CRT device. This has developed into a workable relationship with the data system at the University of West Virginia Medical Center. And this is a program called Cobalt XT Triage HF. There are other couple centers in West Virginia too that they're working with. And it looks like this is a good proof that we actually can collaborate. We actually can make something work. And the initial preliminary data that I've seen in my last visit to Morgantown 6 months ago is that we are improving and making a dent on readmissions for heart failure. So the evolution is obviously to take this patient-level data, which we're pretty good at, both in the hospital side, academia, and also industry, where we can coordinate pacemaker data to programming, continuous glucose monitoring to insulin delivery, sensing brain inputs in the frequency domain for changes in output for deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, and turn that into something that's more aggregatable so that we can put the data together and get sample sizes of many N to understand how we can get insights we didn't know about through classic machine learning. And the ultimate would be to have a decent health information exchange framework that is open to all stakeholders. So we, that is industry, I'm still retired, but I'm still using the word we, as somebody pointed out, basically has the tools to be able to support the data combination. So do academic medical centers like the University of Minnesota. How do we become the centerpiece for collecting data from a variety of different data sources listed on the left to be able to provide important findings and from advanced analytics on the right? That includes everything from identifying patients may be at risk to improving the algorithms that are in our devices, which use edge computing, not cloud computing, to be able to change their algorithms to change an outcome. For example, our implantable defibrillators will sense through algorithmic detection a variety of pre-ventricular fibrillation rhythms that can be overdrive paced in order to prevent a VT effect. That was aggregated through lots of patients to understand what those were, and the algorithms can be both personal and also in aggregate. Finally, the notion of what we can do with digital health on the industry side is to advance to the concept of a digital twin. Now, at Medtronic, we do have a few data scientists that are leading the computational modeling group at the FDA, where they have done a variety of patient-simulated clinical trials by looking at almost like advanced FEA analysis on human components. So we can look at things like what would stress and strain be on an aortic graft and what would be signs of early detection of failure. If we combine that with sensors in real time with those computational models that are evolving, one could develop the concept of a digital twin, much like Rolls-Royce does for their jet engines, where they use a variety of sensors that are in real time, can detect the prediction of an engine failure and have the engine changed out before the plane explodes. So these are a little bit far-fetched ideas, but I think realistic ideas, and it's where we can go if we have a decent digital health platform with interoperable exchange of data. I'm going to make a few comments about where we stand, or my viewpoint about evidence development in this new digital world. So the classical component of how we can prove that we have a device that actually improves patients' outcomes is the clinical trial. And here's an example of a stent retriever used to treat acute middle cerebral artery thrombosis for stroke, where you have about an hour or two to pull that clot out. And so that's done in a randomized controlled clinical trial. Results, if positive, are published in a good journal like New England Journal of Medicine. That leads to potentially a change in the guidelines, the American Heart Association stroke component, and turns to a market expansion opportunity for a device company. This is the classical pathway of evidence development rooted in the randomized controlled clinical trial. In a digital health world, again, the main aim of digital health, as I've been talking about, and reliable real-time data and analysis is to improve the health of people, permit better access for the underserved to needed prevention and treatment providers, make earlier diagnosis for treatable disorders, manage chronic conditions to prevent episodes of hospitalizations. There will be a strong desire to use seemingly reliable real-time data and aggregate it to perform traditional clinical research. And that's epidemiologic research and prospective clinical studies and trials. And I'm saying beware. And I'll tell you why. So what are the challenges? If we want to look at doing research, as we know, based on unstructured databases that may be curated, but unstructured, I think we have to have a few basic rules. The first rule is, and these are not the National Academy of Medicine, these are my rules, so take them for what it's worth. The derived clinical research database should be viewed as retrospective observational databases, period. So we're used to looking at really good data that's prospectively collected, maybe even randomized. This data, at least at this current point, is retrospective and observational. Now, there might be point of care randomizations, and I think that's going to be a potential huge leap forward that will either be consented or unconsented. But we have to remember that when we get this really clean data, if we can get a good digital health system, it's observational. The data fields must be standardized. Now, there's a lot of efforts, I know here, under the leadership of Dr. Milton Moe, the NLP program to abstract meaningful information from unstructured data and potentially even use AI and ML algorithms to potentially reduce some of the variance. These aren't always reliable. And this is something that I think there's still science that has to understand whether we can actually get clinical trial grade data from unstructured data. But these methods are potentially ways that we can do that, but they're not completely reliable at this point. What's more important to me is this notion of missing data. So when you do a clinical trial where you make proper inference, a lot of effort is on making sure that all the fields are filled out. So when you do a clinical trial, you'll miss something like an endpoint or something. And that's where, clinical research nurses and others will spend a lot of time on the phone finding a patient to find out exactly what their outcome is, or driving to see them, or having them come back for a special clinical visit just to get that piece of information filled out. I have here that greater than 10% missing data from any field introduces incomplete ascertainment bias. It's probably even down to 5%. I wrote a paper many years ago on incomplete ascertainment for clinical cardiac angiographic follow-up following interventions like stents. And we found, we published in Circulation, we found tremendous bias associated with cohorts that only had 90% follow-up compared to those that had to 99 to 100%. Bias enough that the outcomes were completely different. So missing data and incomplete ascertainment bias is a big issue, and it's something we have to be very wary of if we're going to be doing research on these digital databases. And there are very few, if any, fixes for missing data. People talk about interpolation and so on. It's not reliable in my viewpoint. There may be some cases where it is, but in general, you need to get the data. If we look at other issues, even in randomized controlled clinical trials, there are still problems with clinical trial effects that we just have to be aware of in order for us to make proper inference. Again, I'm just talking about here, if we want to generate evidence from this stuff, you have to be very wary. So medical device trials are complicated because the data is clearly for observational studies may be confounded. And confounding, as you know, is the actual cause of an outcome may not be due to the intervention under study, but rather due to an unmeasured factor, a confounder. Randomization cures this problem, period. Randomization is a gift from God. It cures the problem. Device trials are especially vulnerable to procedure and operative invasion, which enhances the placebo effect and the Hawthorne effect. The placebo effect is the feeling that you got something good when you didn't, because you had a surgery. I mean, it's almost a cognitive dissonance. to feel like I don't want surgery to get better. And Hawthorne effect is the change in subjective outcomes when you're under study. The basis of clinical evidence-based medicine is the randomized study. And that has to be the standard of care, I think, because for one reason, many of our devices are made for-profit device companies like the one I worked for. So we have to be objective as possible and have that stand as an independent verification. For any subjective or semi-objective endpoint, clearly we need to have blinded, sham randomized studies as the general required determinant for true effect on an intervention. So I'm kind of setting the bar pretty high in randomization of where it needs to be. Contrast that with observational data that we may be making a difference on. We just have to be very careful about how we use that data in this new digital health world. And when we can randomize in that digital health world, the better. I want to give you a quick example of even studies that are randomized and how they can be misinterpreted. So we talked about the trial effects, Hawthorne and placebo. Years ago, there was a therapy called laser angiogenesis, which was used for patients with intractable coronary disease and heart failure. And the idea was to cross the aortic valve with a YAG laser and do half-thickness holes in about 40 or 50 times in the left ventricle to be able to stimulate the heart to contract. And the idea was it would generate an embryonic process called angiogenesis and develop new blood vessels and come back. The basic science in that was somewhat weak. The models, animal models were weak, but it was very exciting. And you couldn't go to a American Heart Association meeting or American College of Cardiology where they didn't talk about the promise of laser angiogenesis for people who couldn't undergo angioplasty or bypass surgery. So there was a company called Biosense, and the endpoint for measuring this was how long could you walk on a treadmill. So patients would walk on a treadmill until they had angina, had to stop, get the therapy, and then come back a few months later and see how far they could walk, and that was the endpoint. This is a single-arm study published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology around 1993 or whatever, and we demonstrated that in a sample of 76 patients, we had a tremendous improvement in exercise tolerance over 100 seconds, and that is a very big improvement in this area. Super exciting. There was another company, that was a Johnson & Johnson company that I was working with. We did that study when I was at Harvard. There's another company called Pacific Laser Angiogenesis. They had a different laser, but the exact same thing. And they basically did a randomized controlled open label study where everybody knew whether they got the laser or not. And these are the results of that study. Demonstrated that there was tremendous improvement in exercise tolerance when you got the laser compared to not getting the laser. They didn't get a sham. They just said, well, we flipped the coin and you're not going to get the laser. Can you do an exercise tolerance test for us? Or you flip the coin, we're going to give you the laser. Here's the laser. Now do the exercise tolerance test. And we saw a tremendous difference overall. This went through the FDA and was on this way to being approved as a new therapy for coronary disease. The Johnson & Johnson study that I was involved with was a little bit behind the Pacific study. It was a different company. And we insisted, based on these improvements in outcomes, that we do a blinded sham study. So what we had was high-dose laser, low-dose laser, or no laser. We would just wiggle the catheter in the leg for 20 minutes, and the patient didn't know whether they were getting the therapy or not. Our results for laser angiogenesis, unlike the Pacific results, was this. Absolutely no difference between the three arms. No effect of laser at all. In many cases, the placebo actually did better in looking at changes in exercise. So this is a classic example of, even when you do a randomized controlled clinical trial, a subjective outcome like how long can you walk on a treadmill with people coaching you because they know you got the laser versus those that say, oh, you're probably going to die because you didn't get the laser, is really a big issue in clinical trials. And I just wanted to point that out, that this is an issue we have to pay attention to, that even when we're looking at observational data, even a randomized controlled clinical trials, you need to be very structured with your data, and in some cases a sham controlled clinical trial. Why does that happen? Because placebo effect is a consequence of cognitive dissonance. And when patients are treated and told by very enthusiastic clinicians and others that you're getting the newest therapy and this must make you feel better, there's a tremendous response that people have, and it's mainly frontal lobe derived. There was a very interesting study done in Germany about 15 years ago, published in Neuron, a good journal, that took normal subjects and had them hold on to a painful stimulus, like a rod that was somewhat electrified, for as long as they could until they couldn't hold on anymore, and then recorded that time. They then put a skin cream on the forearm and told them that it was a new anesthetic. And they held on, and the people could hold on for twice as long as they did when they didn't have the skin cream on. Interestingly enough, they did functional MRI during this test and demonstrated that during the fraud or the lie that this was an anesthetic skin cream, these patients had more metabolic activity at the paraqueductal gray area and other areas of the brainstem, which we know exude opioids internally to potentially reduce that pain medication. And this is all frontal lobe mediated. So the idea here was that you have the belief system that you got something that's important, and it basically has direct communication with opioid centers and pain centers that allowed for internal opioids to be released, and could explain why placebo effect works, might explain why faith healers can make people stand up when they couldn't stand up before, or why people might walk on coals. So there is a true physiological reason to the placebo effect. And it's just something we have to be aware of. Again, another common problem associated with why we need to really structure clinical research when we do outcomes. I've also got comments that well, look, if it works by reducing pain, why don't we just lie to people, tell them it's going to work? The answer is we can't. We don't lie to people. So the key is that this is a real effect, and I just want to point out the fact that structured clinical research is still important. So I want to just finish with a demonstration of one company that I have some insight into, which is a small company, it's not Medtronic, who is developing interesting new biometric sensors as an example of a whole bunch of companies now that are really coming up with some very cool biometric sensors that we need to be able to connect in real time to our digital health system. This company is called Rockley Photonics, and it's not commercial yet. They're still in their R&D phase. So there's, and I got permission to talk about their stuff. So the idea is that they are developing a watch that can measure desktop type activity, hydration, heart rate, and others by using a wristwatch that is not the classic pulse plethysmography approach, the PPG approach, but rather a novel approach using a technology called silicon photonics. What they do is take a near-infrared set of lasers on the watch, direct them to the subcutaneous tissue of the wrist, and then use absorption spectroscopy built into the chip to look at resonance. And from that, they're able to gather a variety of different spectral patterns that you see on the right there in the near-infrared region that you don't get in visible light, such as you might get from an LED device. So this idea of using near-infrared is very critically important, and they have really good data to demonstrate that they're able to measure, using shortwave infrared resonance, a variety of different outcomes. And if you can't read them, there are different absorption spectrums for alanine, ascorbate, glucose, lactate, urea, ethanol, and creatinine. And these can be quantified through their machine learning process to understand how not only to detect, but they can detect amounts. So this band, which is not commercialized, it's in development, can offer these different endpoints. They have a hydration scale that they've developed, and it's been applied by a variety of different new experiments that they're doing to be able to say, look for hydration, whether you're dehydrated or not, and then leverage that into programs such as risky jobs or people who are working out and so on. So the company's doing an experiment now with firefighters to measure their level of hydration and when they should stop working based on this watch. And they are interested in doing the same thing with a glucose monitor. There are no non-invasive glucose monitors yet. There are a couple companies trying to do this, and this company claims it's going to be able to do it as well. And then, of course, this is their large unreadable eye chart of different applications going forward. But I just want to use an example that we're going to see companies explode in better sensors going forward. We just have to be able to make sure we can connect that data, maybe through an iPhone, to our digital healthcare system to make things work. Another application is for hypertension. We know hypertension is a big problem. We know that mild reductions of hypertension, 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury on the systolic side, can reduce significantly the probability of heart failure, ischemic heart disease, cardiovascular health, and so on. This is something most people don't appreciate, but even just a tiny bit reduction in your blood pressure can reduce these incidents going forward. The challenges are that this clear most destructive disorder, I think, worldwide, is that hypertension goes undiagnosed. We know that in Cleveland, for example, we have examples that in underserved communities, the first indication of untreated hypertension was presentation of kidney failure and dialysis, which is a tragedy. So someone in their 40s comes in with a kidney failure, and they didn't know that since age 20 they've had hypertension. So there are at least 4 medtech companies now working on or marketing a wearable intermittent or continuous blood pressure monitor watch. They're not quite there yet, but they will be there. I think that it'll just take some time, and they're using machine learning and AI to finalize and out their algorithms. These include companies called Tula Health, Akia, BioB Technologies from Israel, and also Rocket Photonics. So I'm just excited about the fact that we will get an explosion, I think, of biosensors to be able to put into this digital health world. If we look at BP, there are some challenges. We have to have some input from academic centers. If you can measure blood pressure, how do you measure it? If I'm working out, my blood pressure is going to go high. Does that set off an alert? Is this like the iPhone in a crash in a car? It becomes an issue. Or do I sit down every morning and put my feet on the ground and sit in a seated position and have a blood pressure done every day like that? Is there a way to accumulate the data to look at patterns? Nobody knows this yet. The technology is going to come before we understand the use conditions. And that's going to be important for clinicians to work with these companies to understand how to use this data and make it usable. So I'm going to give my last slide here. And it's hard to limit this just one slide, but let me just make a few comments about some conclusions about my viewpoint about medtech and the inevitable and good digital health revolution. So the principles of digital health and its applications, including advanced analytics, are critical to move forward to a more effective disease management system in near real time, and to a preventive strategy that realizes health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and merely not the absence of disease or infirmity. The alignment and collaboration of medtech is critical to its own future, and I'm talking about a business future, as well as to the success of the digital health revolution. Medtech must focus on interoperable and shareable device data systems that combine with patients, providers, health and healthcare systems, like EHRs, to allow aggregatable and analyzable data for greater health insights. A focused pipeline of medical device embedded in wearable biometric sensor technology will improve both the goals of continuous preventive strategies and access to care for the presently underserved. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think we have time for a couple of questions, and we have some microphones that are circulating. So, Andrew?
She can do that one.
Thanks.
Medtech has not done a very good job of cooperating in the past. What gives you optimism they'll do better in the future?
Thanks. That's a good comment. That's a declaration.
All right. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So it's a fascinating talk, lots of food for thought. Many questions come to my mind. One of them you mentioned the limitations of the randomized clinical trials very clearly, and the inadequacy of data that's collected, incompleteness and so forth. But my question is, could we turn it around and see that there are, of course, you get gold standard information from the RCTs, as you said, given their limitations, but there's a massive amount of data at population level, and there are new techniques that are coming in. Look at ChatGPT. It doesn't really know anything, and yet it pretends to know so much more, right? So the question is, do you see possibilities of using data that's available at a very large scale, leading to information that may, in some cases, give you more information that you could ever get from RCTs?
Yes, I mean, I think, thanks for bringing that up. That's important, I would say, epidemiological and prospective clinical trial question. By the way, I did type the title of my talk into ChatGPT and got about a 15-page summary that I probably should have read. They're horses for courses, right? So if you want to look at the impact of an intervention comparable to the alternative, whether it's standard of care or different intervention, nothing beats a randomized controlled clinical trial. Because to focus on the intervention effect, you've got to make sure that the other confounders are equally distributed both sides. And randomization does a very good job of doing that. And therefore, if you have a connected and believable endpoint that's associated with the impact of that intervention, that can be compared in a continuous or binary way. So that's why the RCT will always be there. And I think that in many ways, in order to avoid these other trial effects that come in, if trial effects are expected because of subjective outcomes, sham it and blind it. Now, a lot of information we want is not about whether pill A is better than pill B. A lot of it's going to be about the effectiveness of how we apply an intervention that was proven by a randomized controlled clinical trial. And you can't do that through an RCT. You have to do that through an observational data set. Clearly, there's going to be different values of those data sets. We know that when we look at the impact of an intervention, it's often done in a very narrow population. When it goes to the post-market, there's a broader population. That's where you can measure, is the effect seemingly equal across these different components? And if not, how do we rectify that? So there are a variety of questions that observational studies can answer that randomized trials don't answer, mainly because of the larger sample size the observational studies provide, and mainly because of its unperturbed approach. Because when you're in a randomized controlled clinical trial, there is an element of artificiality. No question about it, that you can't get over. So observational, where you're having an arm's length, provides a lot of information. It's just not going to be specifically about the effect of an intervention.
Yeah, and it could be an entirely different kind of question one could answer.
Correct.
Medicare data, I mean, you have millions, hundreds of millions of people enrolled there, so.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the international perspective. So looking at countries like China or, by contrast, Norway, can you give us a perspective on their progress in this, in digital health?
Yes. I was just mentioning, I was just in Stockholm 2 weeks ago and spent about a week there in looking at some healthcare systems. Sweden's ahead of us. I mean, they have a socialized healthcare system. They have a very advanced data system they do use Epic to some degree, but they have more applications on their APIs than I think we do. The shareability is not questioned, which there is there. So I think that with national healthcare systems, I'm not making a comment as a non-expert, but my guess is, because population health people probably should be down here, my guess is that the problem of the underserved is going to be less because there's going to be more, universal insurance available for individuals. So I think that I know that the UK NHS has a big digital health initiative, and I know that the Nordics are also pushing that in a big way. And I saw firsthand some of the efforts that we saw in Sweden. So I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think that we're probably behind.
Rick, nice talk. Building on that question, I'm wondering if you can see way up here in the convergence of all these systems ultimately. I mean,
it should be solvable. I mean, if you look at the examples that everybody quotes, we solve this in the financial systems. The check you write is completely interchangeable with it. I mean, that data is all there. If we look at the stuff with the embargo on the Russia investments, that was through the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is a very accurate method of charting and recording in blockchain all financial transitions. So we see this. We see this in airlines. I mean, airlines have a way of, you can book your own appointment, and that data is widely available and shareable. So we see that other industries have done that. Healthcare is more complicated. I mean, to be sure. So I think the answer is if there's a willingness, and I think that people are going to be more willing. I mean, I can tell you that data sharing, we would never expected industry would share data because it's all competitive. Well, we had an issue with one of our products a while back where we were accused of ghostwriting data in clinical trials. So we shared the data with an academic group at Yale. Complete all 20 clinical trials. They said, take it. You analyze it on your own. And it came out to be a huge success for us. So we're starting to see industry breaking down its interest in sharing because in many ways, the goals of the shareability is in a pre-competitive space. It's not a competitive space. It's going to be a thing that raises the tide for everybody. We're starting to see a little bit more coalition between competitors and trying to solve some issues, especially some technical sharing. So I think Brenda, that it's going to happen. I mean, I think the digital health promise and goals is going to happen. It's just going to be how painful is it going to be and how long is it going to take.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I absolutely agree conceptually that the digital health revolution will help healthcare disparities, but kind of diving down, what is it, right? So many other things that have come along, we've said, okay, it is going to help, telemedicine, other kinds of things. A world where we've got a number of new gadgets like the BioBeat watch or the Rockler watch, still fairly expensive, still there's a distribution problem. So what do you think it is about the digital health revolution that is going to finally move that needle?
Well, we've had discussions about this in the Cleveland grant application, and part of it is if we can get data, especially about neighborhoods, food deserts, nutritional things, to our population health individuals who have policy capabilities and connections with city governments and state governments, that there may be policy changes that can happen, but the data has to be there. So I think there has to be money spent. There has to be these devices have to be free. We have to recognize that in the end it'll be better. The thesis on the NSF Engine grant from Cleveland was invest in this idea of improving access to healthcare in the underserved because they will be productive citizens and generate an economic engine. So the thesis was you can't be economically productive if you're ill and don't have access to healthcare. So there might be an economic flywheel that drives that. I hope it does. And I know, at least in the state of Ohio, there's been a lot of investment from them into putting these efforts into trying to get better access to the underserved, believing that they will generate better economic outcomes. But again, there's a lot of health population and health economics people here that know this much better than I do. And I just hope they all agree that this is potentially a positive outcome.
So I think we're running late for one last question.
We have a question from the online audience. Rick, do you have any examples of digital health companies achieving reimbursement for chronic monitoring of patients at home? If so, what sort of reimbursement for the MD and what sort of reimbursement for the company that developed the technology?
Yeah, so Medtronic had a home monitoring system. I don't know if they still have the system or not, but they were able to negotiate reimbursement fees. And it was mainly with the VA. So we do have an example of where that happened. So I think I can't remember the exact name of the business that we ran those, but they took a contract with VA on depression, diabetes, and heart failure, and they managed to put inexpensive telemedicine communication devices, the computers, and simple blood pressure and weight scales digitally in the homes, and the VA was able to reimburse them for all that. In fact, I think we made a profit on that. I don't know where we stand with CMS on that. I know there have been discussions about that, but I think that, like anything else, if you can demonstrate a reduction in costs, especially to CMS, because you're going to reduce an episodic care event, the reimbursement is just a formulaic process.
Great. Well, we have a small certificate to thank Rick for this nice lecture that he gave today. So thank you, Rick.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
And thank you all very much for coming. If you didn't get your questions answered, Rick will be here.